Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's episode in our series on the history of revolutionary ideas is, in some ways, but only in some ways, a companion to our last one about Christianity. I'm going to be talking to the leading Islamic scholar and theologian Tim Winter, also known as Abdal Hakim Murad, about what changed in the world in the 7th century with the advent of Islam, and what happened to the world in which Islam spread so rapidly. Tim, maybe we could start by me asking you if it's possible to characterize the world, the kinds of societies in which Islam emerged. So we're talking about the Arabian Peninsula at the beginning of the 7th century. And when I read about it in English, it should be said, the words that get used are words like nomadic, tribal, diverse, which probably is a bit anachronistic, a very 21st century word, polytheistic. Are those words helpful? Are they adequate?
It depends on your view of the sources, really. Unfortunately, historians like to do this tedious philological and archaeological scratching around with toothbrushes for centuries before they know really what a place like pre-Islamic Arabia was actually like. And we are looking into a kind of cloud of unknowing when it comes to the origins of Islam, because unlike, say, the emergence of Christianity, which happens in an educated Roman province with deep traditions of building, of manuscript writing and arguments over scripture, Arabia really is off the map as far as ancient civilizations are concerned. There is a certain amount of archaeological work that's been done. There is a certain amount of apparently authentic pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, which gives us a sense of what the Arab tribes were up to before Islam knocked them for six. And we have some later Muslim historians and Christian historians as well. But it's fair to say that the field really is really open. So when we, on the basis of this kind of cloud of unknowing, try to figure out what Arabia was like, specifically Western Arabia, because this is a huge area, it's a kind of subcontinent really, it's not even a peninsula, on the eve of Islam, what the sources depict do give us some comfort in that they coincide with the image that we would expect given the usual kind of religious and cultural forms associated with nomadic pastoralism. That is to say, the Arabs were firmly divided into tribal units and sub-tribes. They were nomads, given the very harsh, extreme conditions of the peninsula. And their religious forms were, as is normal with pre-axial ancient religious forms, very specific to the individual tribes. So each clan would have its own deity. Each clan would have its own shaman, come priest, come healer, come magician, who would commune with that deity, going into interesting trance-like states and mediating the voice of that deity or the will of the deity or various other kind of obscure oracles, and would represent the kind of priestly function which pre-modern humanity always found to be indispensable. But that deity would be particular to a tribe. And this represents a very ancient form of human life and probably the way in which we all lived for 99% of the human species when we were all hunter-gatherers and pastoralists and existed in a largely polytheistic environment with no sense of universal values, universal deities. So the fact that the ancient Arabic poetry depicts that image coincides with the kind of Durkheimian view of what ancient societies in the Upper Paleolithic probably were like, and what surviving primordial peoples in the Australian outback, for instance, are still like: tribal, shamanistic, focus very much on nature, strong sense of cross-generational solidarity. We can more or less construct a broad outline picture of what the Arabs were doing before Islam came along.
And the phrase you used was before Islam knocked all that for six. But before that happened, it came out of that world. So is it possible to say in what sense it was an extension of that world before or at the same time as completely overturning it? I mean, these two things can simultaneously be true, can't they?
Yeah, it goes against the normal historian's grain to propose some kind of ex nihilo complete paradigm shift whereby the world is made new again. Human nature doesn't usually work like that. And anybody who pops up crying in the wilderness saying, actually, you've got everything wrong, is likely not to make much headway. However, we do also have the fact of the paradigm shift that early Islam instantiated. The Quran is not like what the Arabs were doing before Islam. And there is a school of historians, perhaps even the dominant school at the moment, which likes to see Islam as being more in continuity with Jewish and Christian precedents than with ancient pagan Arabian precedents. In other words, it's the Arabs trading up to the monotheistic narratives and some of the great biblical stories of their neighbors. Because, if you like, the image of the rise of Islam is more or less the exact opposite of what we are familiar with, perhaps with the rise of Christianity. Christianity emerges in a monotheistic island in the middle of a pagan world, whereas Islam emerges in one of the last pagan islands when the rest of the world had really traded up to one of the major axial religions. Arabia is the last holdout for ancient polytheism and tribal life. So there are continuities which you can identify, but by and large, if you take the Quran as a guide, and it does seem to be an authentic document from the Prophet's time, most historians would accept that because we have radiocarbon dating of ancient fragments that do seem to be from at least the lifetime of the companions of the Prophet, and they coincide with the Quran that we know and love today. That the Arabs had been yanked, it seems, from one end of the religious spectrum to the other. They believed in a plurality of deities, and now suddenly they believed in a very absolute, rigorous monotheism. It seems that they had no belief particularly in life after death, whereas the Quran is full of preoccupations about death, the judgment, heaven, hell. That was certainly a paradigm shift. They had not had a legal system before Islam because it wouldn't really make sense in a nomadic world. Instead, each tribe tended to operate on a kind of vendetta basis. So if you stole a sheep from a neighboring tribe, then they would steal a sheep from your tribe, and it would be that kind of culture. But there was no sense of an overarching set of values to which everybody was expected to comply. And then Islam comes along with its Sharia, which is by and large not interested in people's tribal or ethnic affiliations at all. It's interested in whether you're from the religious in-group, not whether you're even an Arab or a Persian or a Turk. It's remarkably universal. So those are three salient examples of how Arabian culture was really bowled over permanently, because this is a permanent revolution. There have been great conquests historically by nomadic pastoralists. You think of the Mongols, for instance. But generally, those conquerors, after a generation or two, trade up to the more civilized religious traditions of the countries that they've overrun. So the Mongols mostly become Christians or particularly Muslims, and they turn into the Moguls, they turn into the great horde of the Russian steppes. But the early Arabs didn't do that. So, as well as the puzzle for us historians of how this paradigm shift was affected, you have the perhaps deeper puzzle of how it managed to be permanent and survived the death of the original visionary, and managed to overturn far more civilized and literate civilizations in the Christian Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, and within 100 years, these people are dabbling their toes in the Atlantic and the coast of Portugal, and they're also fighting against the Chinese in central China. Extraordinary civilizational achievement. But the big enigma for us is how they managed to succeed religiously.
So before we come on to that enigma, that puzzle, which is I want to focus on, you said that this was monotheism in the place that was the holdout against it, the polytheistic holdout, but not a complete holdout in that monotheistic religion had spread, had it not, to parts of Arabia. How, at the very beginning, were those relations understood? So as Islam emerged, and by the very beginning, the absolute initial moment, but in the early decades, what was the relationship not just between Islam and its sort of polytheistic environs, but also with the competing monotheisms, particularly Judaism, but Christianity as well? Was it accommodating? I mean, it had an explanation for them. It was able to, as it were, accommodate them in that sense. But was it accommodating in a more social or even political sense?
Well, in the early period, we know that there were Jewish communities in the realms that the Prophet established. And we know that the Quran evidently is shall we say, in continuity with much of the biblical narrative, so that the famous stories of the biblical text, Joseph and his brothers, Moses and the Red Sea, Abraham and his sacrifice, they were also embedded in the Quranic text. So, as one historian put it in the 19th century, the Arabs were Jews on horses because they had this religion that looked like Judaism. People were circumcised, they didn't eat pork, they maintained certain purity laws, and it looked like a Jewish thing. But they went out and conquered the world, which Jews generally didn't aspire to do. So if you're looking for continuities with neighboring monotheisms, Judaism is quite possibly your first port of call. And modern historians have pointed to the Islam-Judaism relationship as being historically and, as it were, metabolically the closest relationship between any two major world religions. And because the Quran insists on a kind of reverential attitude towards Jewish scripture, it says the Torah contains guidance and a light. You find that even though the Enlightenment idea of legal or social equality would have seemed extremely strange in the 7th century, Jewish communities often were able to thrive in the Muslim world. So about 90% of Jews in the Middle Ages lived in the Muslim world, not in Christendom. By and large, there wasn't a story of pogroms, there wasn't the blood libel, the idea of Jews collectively responsible for deicide. None of that would make sense in the Islamic context. And where there was a kind of stereotypical whipping boy in early Arabic literature, it tended not to be the figure of the perfidious Jew, but rather Zoroastrians. They're the ones who become the kind of dark other, the kind of stereotypical figure of perfidy and unbelief. It's very hard to find medieval Muslim polemical works against Judaism, for instance.
Why particularly Zoroastrianism? What was the underlying animus there?
I think because it was seen as not really monotheistic and quite different, and also the idea was that it was a highly hierarchical kind of society with an aristocratic and priestly elite which practiced serious religion and left the peasantry to their own devices, which offended egalitarian, if that's the word, sensibilities of the early Muslim conquerors. But it does seem to be the case that there is an absence of medieval Muslim polemic against Judaism as such. There's polemic against Christianity. There's polemic against Zoroastrianism. There's writings about Hinduism and Buddhism, because Islam is at the center of the ancient world, so it engages with not just other monotheisms, but extensively with Indian religions as well. But the relationship with Judaism was, as you see in the life of somebody like Maimonides later on, who becomes the greatest Jewish thinker of his time, but is also trusted to be the personal physician of Saladin, and writes his great works in Arabic and is really integrated into Muslim intellectual cultural life, that there is a kind of, as Samuel Goitein, the historian, put it, a fruitful symbiosis between medieval Islam and Judaism, which was not generally possible for Judaism in Christendom.
And yet at the beginning, there are clearly ways in which Islam does represent a fundamental break. And I want to see if we can try and characterize what is the upending that happens with the arrival of Islam. So if we do law to start with, ideas of law in the monotheistic religions, particularly, but more broadly, conceptions of law at the time. So as you said, for nomadic tribal peoples, the idea of law would have been very different if it made sense at all. But in Christianity, in Judaism, there is a clear understanding of law and divine law and revelation and the rest. In what ways is Islamic law, is Sharia fundamentally different from the beginning?
From the beginning, well, Islamic law, as we think we are familiar with it today, is not a direct product of Muslim legal reflection in the first couple of centuries, because in that period, following the sudden, almost absent-minded acquisition of this gigantic empire, the early Muslim rulers, by and large, allowed things to continue with their largely non-Muslim subject populations as they'd always been. So for the first few decades, they didn't even bother to remove the image of the Byzantine emperor from the coinage, for instance. That had to wait the best part of 100 years. Local customary laws, by and large, left in place. The idea of Islamic law as a distinct legal tradition had to wait really until the 3rd or the 4th century of the new religion, until it finally crystallized out in the Sunni context as 4 different and putatively equal traditions of interpretation, which are all quite different from each other. If one is to speculate on what constitutes the difference between Islamic law, which one hastens to add is a very diverse tradition, And although journalists like to speak of Sharia law, there isn't really such a thing as there is, say, an English common law or a Napoleonic code or a code of Justinian. It's a very broad, diverse, conflictual body of schools of interpretation, how you relate to the scriptures, to what extent local customary precedent is authoritative, what is the authority of a judge, what is the relationship between government and the administration of law. There's no real consensus on most of these issues. Because Islam doesn't have a church, doesn't have a magisterium, there's no one Muslim pope who can say this is the correct interpretation of the religion and impose or invite unanimity on that basis. And the enormous geographical spread of Islam meant that Islamic law, as it evolves in, say, Muslim Spain, does have quite a different temper to the way it evolved in present-day Central Asia, Uzbekistan, those places, or India. So, yeah, Sharia law is a somewhat treacherous category. There's an Islamic legal tradition, very diverse, endlessly evolving. One of the characteristic things about it, I suppose, is that it is not state law. And this, for students, is very perplexing because that's all our MPs do, isn't it, in Parliament? They just pass laws and there's a new Act of Parliament every couple of days, and that's what we appoint them to do. But in the classic Islamic Sharia vision, the government, that is to say the Sultan, the Caliph, the King, doesn't pass laws. God passes laws as expressed in the Quran and the precedent of the Prophet, and those have to be interpreted by a body of scholars which is quite freewheeling and loosely constituted, and who usually don't agree on anything. So you have this very strange model of a very charismatic model of the caliphate, with the caliph as the most powerful man on earth in his palace in Baghdad with its concentric 7 walls and guarded by lions, and it's the Sinbad the Sailor kind of Arabian Nights. It was the center of the world at the time. Baghdad had 1 million people at a time when the biggest cities in Europe had maybe 40 or 50,000. So this kind of representative of God, shadow of God on earth, actually had very few of the powers that nowadays we associate with government. He had to be a he, was responsible for declaring war. He was responsible for making sure that the Friday prayers were established, and his name would always be recited as part of the sort of formal peroration at the end of the Friday prayers. He would have his name on the coinage. There were 8 canonical penalties, such as the death penalty, which was his responsibility to make sure were enforced, but he had absolutely no religious jurisdiction at all. He couldn't force people to believe something or not to believe something. It wasn't like Henry VIII or the Russian Tsar's tradition of Caesar, a papist, control of religion by the state. The Byzantines had the same tradition, of course, but it's a very odd model which massively devolves religious authority to individual knots of scholars and madrasas and schools of thought, varies in time. And that could be one of the revolutionary aspects of Islam, in that it introduces this very unfamiliar idea of a charismatic world ruler who actually can't legislate and isn't allowed to get involved in the legislative process, unless it's abusive, of course, and sultans sometimes did get involved. And this, of course, also reminds us, I suppose, of the fact that modern Islamism, Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat-e-Islami, Al-Qaeda, and so forth, represent, by their own acknowledgement, radical break with the Islamic past, because they do accept the Western model of the nation state, which alone has the right to punish, which alone has the right to enact and enforce laws. But all of that is very new in the Islamic world, and medieval Muslims confronted with something like Hamas would have been completely bewildered by it. Things have moved on. So that maybe is one of the most original features of Islamic law, the fact that it is not state law, but is a scholar's law, or ultimately attributed to the divine will.
And does that mean that it's, if not revolutionary, it is at least potentially destabilizing of any form of political authority or political rule that does claim the sort of authority that we actually associate with political rule and states now, that once this version of law exists in the world with its universal claims, it also potentially has the ability to, in any context, to destabilize aggrandizing political claims?
Yes, it could be seen as rooted in, as so many monotheistic conceptions are, in ancient Israelite ideas of the law and the will of God being above the the vain preferences of Pharaoh or Nimrod. There's a certain revolutionary potential in the monotheistic project that does kind of drive the money changers out of the temple and is troublemaking in that sense. And certainly Byzantine ideas of monarchical absolutism, the ruler as the fountainhead of values and law, were regarded with great surprise and puzzlement by Muslims. And one of the theories for the rapidity of the Muslim conquests is that the centralization of law and also taxation by the Byzantine Empire made the Arab conquerors in the 7th century not entirely unwelcome in places like Egypt, Syria, and elsewhere, because landowners and others, even generals, were hoping for tax breaks, which they did receive because taxation was much lower under the early Muslim conquerors than it was under the Byzantine state, which had to maintain a standing army with a lot of heavy cavalry and feudal responsibilities. So it might well be, in fact, I think it probably is the case, that the arrival of the completely unexpected dusty Arabian conquerors in the 7th and early 8th century was experienced as a kind of relief or a liberation from the heavy hand of the Persian and the Byzantine empires that had gone before, because people were given, again, it's not freedom in the contemporary sense at all, but a lot more autonomy from the state, and had, as Muslims always did, have the right to choose which kind of interpretation of the law that they preferred. So in that sense, it certainly was revolutionary. Another aspect of that, which might have been less popular, was that it overturned the feudal system, because the Quran, although it leaves quite a lot of legal things pretty open, does specifically lay down the law regarding inheritance, which means that the law of primogeniture, which was the basis of the feudal system for the Byzantines and for the Latin West, is not allowed in Islamic law. Because when you shuffle off your earthly coil, your estate is divided according to certain proportions amongst relatives and non-relatives, as laid down very explicitly in a long Quranic verse. And there's no wriggle room that allows you to get out of that. So sons, daughters, aunts, descendants, grandchildren all have a share in your inheritance, which meant that if you were the ruler of a great estate, you could be pretty sure that that estate would not be in your family's hands significantly in a couple of generations' time. So that was another, I suppose, revolutionary aspect, and may also account for, especially in the Persian context, where the Morbed and the Dehqan landowners were pretty unpopular, might well have presented Islam as a kind of liberation theology that allowed the masses to reclaim more of the economic life of the community, and certainly allowed a lot more social mobility in societies which hitherto, partly because of the feudalism, had been extremely hierarchical and immobile.
One of the episodes we're about to do for this series is on Magna Carta, and as you were speaking, it made me think of that document, which has a reputation for radicalism, is almost all about preserving feudal inheritance against the possibility of the king undermining it. It's less radical in many ways than it appears.
Yes, the peasants didn't get a vote, did they?
No, they didn't. And what people wanted to do was to pass on their estates. Another way in which Islam, from, I won't say the beginning, but from somewhere near the beginning, is at least potentially radically different from other monotheistic religions that existed at the time, is in its understanding of good and evil and sin and the role of God as the causal force in the universe. Is it possible to sketch out how big a departure that was from what Christian theology had only evolved to a certain point at this time, but still from what existed around then in the rival religions?
Well, when it comes to getting our head around the different religions' responses to the biggest questions of all, why is there evil in the world? Does the world exist in time? Is God subject to time? Do we have free will? Those sort of ancient posers. Islamic theology comes up with different answers, as Jewish theology does and as Christian theology does. And that has, in many ways, sort of invigorated and kept, I suppose, the Muslim mind alive. The Quran, however, is arguing against a pagan world where the idea of divine omnipotence is really not understood at all. It's rather like the Homeric sagas, different gods kind of competing with each other and behaving in a quite whimsical way, and history becomes this kind of dramatic theatre. The Quran is seeking to overturn that by attributing everything that exists in the world, as it says, every leaf that falls, to the direct divine agency, in order to strip the pagan Arab deities of any kind of credibility. So there's a very strong emphasis in the Quranic text on divine power and omnipotence, which, as Islamic theology develops over the next few hundred years, results in a cosmology that it looks quite deterministic. That is to say, the idea that human beings can somehow do what God didn't know would happen, or that human beings can go against what God has decreed, seems to be a compromise of the monotheistic principle. So Islamic theology in most of its schools is quite deterministic, because the idea of God being omnipotent doesn't just mean he can do whatever he wants, but he does everything, which is the view that you get in some Protestant theologies, such as Calvin, for instance. But generally, the majority of Catholic and most Protestant thinkers have recoiled from that idea of a completely predetermined universe, because it seems to make human beings into puppets that really can't have a significant moral life. There were various compatibilist, would be the technical term for it, maneuvers within Islamic theology that sought to link divine omnipotence to human accountability. To cut an ongoing story short, one of these was the idea that God creates our actions, but human beings acquire them. That is to say, there is a volitional, mystical, non-corporeal force within the human consciousness that aligns morally with some of the things that we are doing, but not with others, which would be, I suppose, equivalent to the difference between murder and manslaughter. So it's what we do is morally significant in terms of what we intend by what we do rather than what we actually do. So Muslim theology, so-called Kalam theology, is more deterministic looking than much Catholic theology and Byzantine theology as well, but does believe that it has retained the all-important principle of human accountability. So that, I suppose, would be something original, although it took them some centuries to work it out as a systematic method and produce manuals and creeds so that it became normative.
And before I ask you a bit more about what happened and what else might explain the rapid spread of this new religion, one more category, sex and the erotic. There is something fundamentally different going on, isn't there, if one thinks about what existed before Islam and what existed after?
Yup. The Christian tradition, which was dominant in the neighboring countries, had by this time absorbed the church fathers' anxieties about eros and assumed that the path to sainthood or priesthood should be through celibacy. And one of the bases for this was the idea that the priest or the monk or the saint lives, as they put it, proleptically, the life of the blessed. And St. Paul has said there's no marriage in heaven. Therefore, the saint who is living in anticipation of heaven in this world should not be married and should not have that aspect of humanity in his or her life. One of the, if you like, again, revolutionary features of the Quranic narrative is that it proposes an eroticized paradise. There are maidens there, they're charming. Eros is one of the delights of the blessed in the eternal gardens, which really is certainly not biblical. It's not really Judaic, because at this time Judaism doesn't really have much of a preoccupation with life after death. And it did appall the church fathers, and Aquinas later on uses this as one of his key arguments against the legitimacy of Muhammad's prophethood, that believers will somehow be engaged in some kind of eternal orgy in the hereafter, and that's not what you'd expect a proper religious teacher to promise his followers. It becomes a standard feature of Christian polemic. But if you believe that the life of the blessed is going to be in some sense, however symbolic, an erotic thing, then your understanding of human sexuality in this world is going to look very different. And so Islamic theology develops sort of complex, sort of Kama Sutra type literatures. That's an Indic text, but there are Islamic equivalents as well. And some of the best Islamic theologians wrote pillow books and guides to how to keep your wife happy and things like that. And that was regarded as a normal part of religious life. So that was something quite different. the centrality of the public bath, the Turkish bath, the hammam in Muslim cultures, which had largely been shut down by the particular form of Christianity embraced before that time. The Romans had public baths, the Christians shut them down, the Muslims opened them up again, although separating the genders, of course, evinced quite a different attitude to the body, I think. So, yeah, that was certainly a transformation and linked ultimately to a different anthropology in that in the Quran, which tells the story of the Garden of Eden several times, Adam and Eve do fall, but immediately afterwards they say sorry and God draws a line under original sin and there is no more original sin. So the idea, which comes in apparently with St. Paul and is picked up by Augustine and others, of human beings being damnable because of the sin of an ancestor has never been part of Islamic theology. And it's not really part of Jewish theology either. Original sin is not really a thing for most Jewish thinkers. It's something that comes in the post-biblical period in Christianity. So if the church fathers say Eros emerges because Adam became mortal and therefore human beings need to reproduce themselves and therefore reproduction is a sign of our fallen state, then in the Islamic context where human beings are not fallen anyway, then this normal aspect of human biology is not really seen as a reminder of sin, but is just a divine gift and a reminder of paradise and a necessary and righteous way in which the human spirit is satisfied and the species goes forth and multiplies. So that, I guess, has been, and because of endless human anxieties about sexuality, is a kind of, as I say, polemical theme for Christian arguments against Islam in the medieval period, although I suspect not much nowadays because Christian attitudes now are quite different to how they were in earlier centuries. They've moved on.
So if we then think about the rapidity of the spread and the breadth of it, I mean, the astonishing breadth of the spread of this religion and the different kinds of ways of life and societies that it encompassed within centuries. And you've touched on how that might be explained. It could be explained in terms of the appeal of some of the ideas that you've just described, including the last one. I mean, one can think of contexts in which that is, at least for men, quite appealing. But this was also conquest. I mean, it was both, right? And as you said, Christianity exists within an empire. It emerges within an empire. And the fact that there is a pre-existing empire is absolutely central to the way in which this universal religion in its own terms spreads. This emerges outside of any imperial setting, but it becomes a kind of empire. What kind of empire is it? And given, I can't think of another word than diversity, given the diversity of what it contained, is it something completely different from pre-existing empires?
In many ways, I think it is, because it preserves this ancient Arabian, egalitarian, tribal view whereby the chief is just the first amongst equals, with the administrative bureaucracy of the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire, because if you think about the map and the history, the only person who'd ever succeeded in uniting the Iranian areas with Mediterranean was Alexander the Great. The Roman emperors had tried to invade Persia, and the Persians had tried to take over the Greek world, but they never succeeded. But the Arabs, with very little effort, managed to do it, and they do it permanently. So the former Iron Curtain, which was a very significant cultural divide between the Iranian and the Indic world to the east and the Mediterranean world, was suddenly overcome. And you have different Islamic dynasties in the early period oscillating between Arab or Byzantine-ish or Persian models of kingship. And eventually the model that prevailed was the Persian model, when the capital moved from Damascus to near Baghdad, and which is part of the Persian sphere of influence. But it was nonetheless, as a great world empire, and empire is the correct term for it, curious, largely, I think, because of the issue that we mentioned earlier of the absence of a legal and religious coercive authority in the ruler. They tried sometimes to impose their view. The Caliph al-Ma'mun in the 9th century tried very hard to impose his idea that the Quran is created, which is a technical issue in Muslim theology, on everybody. But it's actually very difficult to do that, because if you're Henry VIII, for instance, or Elizabeth I, or a Russian Tsar, you have authority over the way in which religion is administered. And you can put the 39 Articles of the Church of England into evensong which everybody has to attend in an English village, and you can impose your doctrines on the population. Muslim worship doesn't really include any detailed creedal statements, and no ruler has the right to or the ability to change it. So the Muslim prayer, which you can see in any mosque in England now, is, as far as we can tell, verbatim and exactly the same as what the early Muslims have experienced, because nobody gets to change it. Again, if you're interested in the revolutionary idea, that might be something to think about, that despite 14 centuries of vicissitudes and despite the enormous geographical extent of the Muslim world, forms of Islam are pretty uniform everywhere. And that's partly because no government has the right to interfere with them. And anybody who tried to change anything in, say, the Muslim dawn prayer, that would be absolutely scandalous and nobody would go to the mosque. So this Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early Abbasid period did try to impose his idea that the Quran is created and flogged scholars who disagreed, and that lasted for about 20 years, but eventually the caliphate gave up and everything snapped back into the kind of former consensual position. So the kind of imperial interference that you get, for instance, with some of the early church councils, Chalcedon, Council of Constantinople, after the Christianizing of the Roman Empire, with the emperor presiding over all of the bishops and trying to influence the vote on key doctrinal principles, that's completely alien and unknown in Islamic civilization. And it would be regarded as scandalous if a mere ruler tried to impose his theological or liturgical eccentricities on the population. So if you like, it was a comparatively libertarian space. Again, this sounds like a suspiciously Enlightenment category. But the reality is that until modernity produces either secularity or Islamism, Muslim scholars always enjoyed diversity and took it as a natural feature of the religion, that there would be 20 different interpretations of a Quranic verse, and they knew they'd never really get to the bottom of it because the grammar was difficult or the texts surrounding its early reception were ambiguous. And that enjoyment of a pluriform religious diversity was part of kind of sophisticated, elite Muslim religious discourse for 1,000 years. That might be quite different. So, interestingly, at the time of the English Civil War, when all kinds of deep religious questions are up for grabs, somebody called Henry Stubb, who was the king's personal physician for a while and quite a learned man, wrote a book which was so countercultural he couldn't actually publish it at the time. It had to wait 200 or 300 years, but we have the manuscript, in which he's proposing that a good example for Britain, which couldn't decide whether it wanted the divine right of kings or whether it wanted a Puritan commonwealth, was actually the Ottoman model. Because the Ottomans, as every English merchant in Smyrna knew, presided over this incredibly diverse world of different sorts of Christians, different types of Jews, all of whom seemed to be left to their own devices, lots of different sorts of Muslims. So the Ottoman emperor's personal guard, even though he was the Sunni caliph, was always made up of Shi'i soldiers. And to somebody in the England of the time of Archbishop Laud, that seemed absolutely impossible. Everybody knew that you'd have anarchy if you didn't have religious uniformity. So an interesting moment in the English Reformation, the English Enlightenment, and John Locke picks up on this as well with his discourses on the turbaned nations, is why were the Ottomans, and by extension I think many Islamic polities, so successful and long-lived. The Ottoman Empire lasted for 6 centuries, even though they were presiding over this apparent chaotic religious landscape of so many different points of view, which again, rather than, we shouldn't idealize here, we're certainly not egalitarian. If you were not a Muslim, you suffered significant legal disabilities. Muslims were top dog, but nonetheless succeeded in holding together extraordinarily plural realms for centuries in a way that in Western Europe always proved really impossible. So again, a revolutionary idea.
The thing that seems, and maybe this is just seeing it from a modern perspective or having been sort of acclimatized to the other way of thinking, the thing that seems puzzling in that is that the secret to plurality, diversity, tolerance, again, maybe another anachronistic word, is unchangingness in a way. So as you said, there is a continuity because it can't be touched. So because it can't be touched, it can't be interfered with. And because it can't be interfered with, we might think the unchanging, untouchable nature of the underlying doctrine and practice is a sort of stifling thing, but actually what you describe is it's the thing that allows a thousand flowers to bloom. And that is very, very alien, I think, to a Christian and then a secular understanding, which is it changes, but sort of when it changes, everything changes with it. And here we have a version of history in which the unchanging thing is what allows change to happen around it. Or have I misunderstood it?
Yeah, I think we live in a very restless age where we're always trying to improve things and always dissatisfied with the status quo. I suspect that in the pre-modern Islamic world, and probably in pre-modern China and very static societies like that, people by and large believed that the past, especially the distant past, was probably better than the present. There was a golden age, the age of the Yellow Emperor, the age of the Prophet and his companions, the age of the early Ottoman sultans, that things were pretty degenerate nowadays, but nonetheless, everybody knew their place. And the world was conceived of as safe because current structures reflected those that clearly had worked in the past. So if you were in the bazaar in Sarajevo in the 17th century, and there were Jewish shops and Christian shops and the Orthodox and the Catholics and different sorts of Muslims, that was made convivial and possible because it had always been like that, and people knew that these groups were not a threat because this conviviality, this plurality, perhaps not pluralism, had always been a feature of people's lives. And part of the problem I think we experience now in modern Europe is that our experience of plurality is very recent. That when Sarajevo was this multi-ethnic, multi-religious city, in England, you had to follow the religion of the king, and even the Jewish communities existed only on sufferance and suffering from very significant disabilities and occasional massacre, pogroms. So one of the ironies of the current immigration phenomenon, I think, is that most migrants come to Britain from countries with a deep history of plurality, and they're coming to a place whose experience of plurality is very recent and where it was tested beyond the limits of endurance in many corners of Europe in the 20th century through the Holocaust and so forth. Europe historically doesn't have a good record on plurality and accepting neighbours of different kinds and colours and creeds. It's a kind of irony that the migrants are regarded as the harbingers of some totalitarian view, and Europe, which has always been the home of plurality and communal harmony, I think it's more likely to be the other way around.
Isn't it also the case that as well as there being, as you just described it, underpinning this plural world, a sense of something static, with the spread of Islam, you did also get explosions of local culture, art, learning. We might want to frame it in a language of progress because it's often said, there were these rapid advances, but also there was an explosion of diverse forms of learning and expression. I mean, it was a flourishing world as well, wasn't it? That empire, in some of its cultural and artistic expressions, it wasn't a static world at all.
No, a rapid demographic growth, for instance. Cordoba had 1 million people under the Muslim caliphs. Under the Romans, no city had had anything like that number, except perhaps Rome itself. There was enormous economic growth, agricultural innovation, scientific experimentation, and so forth, the kind of thing that to us Europeans who believe that we're the consequence of 1 billion years of evolution. Our civilization is kind of the consequence of Darwinian natural selection, and we're just the best. Looks like progress. But in terms of the cultural sort of paradigm shift that happened, you could consider something like the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which to my mind is perhaps the most mysterious building in the world, because it's the first artifact of this new world empire and civilization. And it's strategically situated as the third temple, the inclusive consummation of the older stories. And it's where the Prophet Muhammad, according to the Muslim story, mystically embraced Moses and Jesus and affirmed himself as being in continuity with that. But the building itself, I don't know if you've been there and stood next to it, it's very mysterious because it's built as Islam's first building during the lifetime of some of the companions of the Prophet who are buried nearby. And yet it doesn't seem like the faltering first amateurish effort of a civilization that needs hundreds of years before it really gets it right. It's extremely mature, sophisticated, refined, restrained. You can see elements of Byzantine design. You can see elements of Persian design. Obviously, they're working with craftsmen and traditions that already exist, but it's really not like a church. It's not like a fire temple. It's Islamic. How it was possible ex nihilo so quickly for them to develop that very refined sensibility, I don't have a clear explanation for it. And yet it's Islam's first foray into culture. That's part of what one historian calls the naked singularity of early Islam, that it just happens like this white-hot explosion of creativity and beauty. Islamic art, calligraphy, design, fabrics, textiles, carpets become some of the wonders of the world, the pride of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Tourists prefer to go to the Taj Mahal than any Hindu temple in India. They like to go to the Alhambra in Spain rather than to the Escorial. Islamic art is very significant and really out-narrates its rivals, I think. But the suddenness with which it emerges, if you've been to the current Silk Road exhibition at the British Museum, you'll see they've got a few early Quranic manuscripts. And again, one is gobsmacked by the rapidity with which the Arabic language, which had been sort of something that nomads would use to talk to each other and recite poetry and sagas around the campfire for millennia, but had not really been a major literary vehicle, suddenly the calligraphy of this previously oral language becomes so exquisite and so mature so quickly. There's hardly anything in the British Library more beautiful than those ancient Qurans on blue vellum with gold ink and the majestic Kufic script. It becomes extremely mature extremely quickly. So again, culturally speaking, a revolution. And like all revolutions, one that is a new recipe but uses many of the ingredients of the past, to use a kind of culinary metaphor. It's pulling things together from earlier civilizations, but the particular fragrance that it generates, that which is explicitly Islamic, is absolutely original and absolutely all its own.
And I think in the West, we associate that kind of paradigm shift, white-hot explosion of creativity with things happening in a place. So if you think about ancient Athens and how quickly it moves from one kind of form of cultural expression to the thing that we associate with 5th century BCE Athens. But it's because, as it were, a group of people are gathered together in a particular place. This is not that. These things happen in different places. And it happens in part, doesn't it, precisely because of the movement of these ideas, the way in which they spread outwards so quickly. Isn't that part of the explanation and what makes it different from what we might think of as the standard Western model we might have in mind? We still have it, right? People think that you have to gather people together in a city or whatever it is, and you have to kind of lock them down so that they will spark off each other. This is not that.
Well, for some of the monumental sultanic endowment mosques of Cordoba, Cairo, Istanbul, the Blue Mosque and so forth, of course, there's a team and there's a sack of gold that the Sultan has thrown.
Yeah, and everything has to happen in a place, but it's not that Athenian version of it, ancient Athenian version of it.
No, and it's also really diverse because compared, say, to church architecture, Islamic architecture is endlessly diverse. A mosque in Morocco looks nothing like a mosque in Sarajevo. Indonesia is a different world as well. So there's a tremendous ability to refract local particularities. But the actual prayer that's the point of the building is identical everywhere. And that kind of unity and diversity, I think, is quite characteristic of Islamic civilization. The doctrinal and liturgical forms are extraordinarily uniform across 1,000 years and thousands of miles, even though the sort of cultural surface of it is much more diverse than it is, say, in ancient Egypt or classical China or medieval Europe. There's perhaps a paradox there.
Two more questions. Very early on in this story, in the story of early Islam, this universal religion experiences fundamental splits. There is Shia, and then there is the emergence of Sufism. To what extent, very early on in the story, is this a set of ideas, practices, and doctrines that contain within them the seeds of the things that will challenge them from the inside? How inherently unstable as a form of order, as a way of organizing the world and how people live, is it from the inside from very early on?
Well, one of the, again, all I've done is to ask questions really rather than proposing solutions. One of the puzzles we deal with is why it is that even though the sociologist Weber and others propose that religions begin as a point of unity, and then as they move in space and time away from that, they develop churches and sects and they proliferate, Islamic history doesn't usually exhibit that pattern. The main sects in Islam, which are the Sunni thing, which is itself very internally differentiated, Shi'ism, which again has different sub-denominations, something called Kharijism and Ibadism, which was big for a while and is now quite small. These all emerged in the first century of Islam, whereas in the second half of Islamic history, there's very little sectarian novelty. That, again, is a paradox that perhaps future generations of historians will be able to resolve. The Sunni Shi'i thing is, in a sense, it can be seen as a fight between two rival conceptions of religious charisma and authority. On the one hand, the idea that authority should be essentially monarchical and therefore it is genetic and inherited, as with most royal families. The eldest son gets to be the charismatic religious leader. Whereas the Sunni perspective was that it should really be a righteous person selected through some kind of consultative, though not really democratic process, certainly not in the early period, and that accidents of birth should not be decisive. That was really a question of political utility, as it was generally experienced, rather than significantly doctrinal. In the first 2 centuries, you can't see very significant doctrinal differences between Sunni and Shi'i Islam. It emerges and becomes quite abrasive and difficult later on. But still, look again at the Ottoman Empire, which is my own particular interest. For 600 years, the Ottoman Empire rules some of the, well, most of the great shrines of Shi'i Islam. They're not interfered with, they're left alone. There's no Reformation type smashing of rival sanctuaries. The Sultan even sends them subsidies. His personal bodyguard and the Janissaries are all made up of quite extreme members of a Shi'i sect, the Bektashis, which is again very odd. And the Ibadis become insignificant by that period. But by and large, if we're looking at the seeds of Islam's downfall in the early period because of these sectarian ructions, they seem to have been managed, at least by the Ottomans. I don't think they're well managed by modern Islam, where these things have become lethal in places like Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, too many countries where the sectarian thing is not well controlled by the contemporary theologies or by the rulers. But that's, I would say, a reflection of the post-normative, you might even be cheeky and say post-orthodox expressions of Islam as an identity politics. Sectarianism, rather like sectarianism in Ulster. It's me versus you, and the actual theology is not something anybody really thinks about, which is very sad, and one hopes that those countries can pull themselves together again. But the auspices are not good at the moment, I'm afraid.
Sufism is a philosophy that embraces, among other things, ideas of purity, asceticism, and so on. The ancient world was awash with notions of purity and asceticism. What made this one different? Because it is different, isn't it?
Well, again, it's really diverse, just as Christian spirituality and monasticism are really diverse. One has to, as a historian, sort of put in these boring caveats. Sufism is certainly not a single thing. So here in Cambridge, for instance, about half of the taxi drivers belong to one or another of the major Sufi orders, but they're not all the same. And if you get into a conversation with them in the traffic, you have to know exactly what their particular saint or sage or the founder of their order says about religion. It's one area in which Islam has been almost endlessly diverse. There are charismatic forms of sainthood. There are ascetical, pietistic versions of Sufism. There are some which are elite orders which develop sophisticated rituals like the famous whirling dervishes of the Mevlevis and complex forms of music and instrumentation. There are others that are very kind of nomocentric and basic and austere. It's not a single movement. The way in which the tradition itself understands it is that it is a focus upon the interior purity of the believer and a preoccupation with the rectification of intention, which might make it sound a little bit Lutheran, perhaps, or perhaps Jesuitical. It's about the scrutiny of the conscience. It's about ensuring the rightness of one's heart and of the interior life, and also has very strong mystical expressions which are familiar to Western readers in the poetry of Rumi, for instance. taking their cue from the prophet's own mysticism, because his ascension from Jerusalem through the seven heavens to the presence of God is a paradigm of the mystical experience. The Sufis see the prophet as the first Sufi and as the exemplum figure for the mystical life in Islam. But Sufism is not really a denomination because it's always historically been a subset of Sunni Islam. So if you go to the major Islamic universities, even today, despite reformism, secularization, Puritanism, Islamism, you'll find that generally the leading scholars adhere to some form of Sufism or other. When I studied in the seminary in Cairo, all of my teachers were involved in Sufism. That didn't make them unorthodox.
We've just touched on in this conversation the idea that there is somewhere at the heart of this religion and this set of ideas. You've used the word egalitarian. It's sometimes described as a vision of social justice. To what extent is it possible to say whether that is secondary to or central to the ways in which Islam is potentially a revolutionary idea?
It certainly emerged as one of history's great revolutions. If you look at Thomas Carlyle in the high Victorian period, in his book Heroes and Hero Worship, where he's using Hegel to describe history as the consequence of certain world historical individuals, heroes who grab history by the horns and force it in a new direction. And his actual favourite figure is actually Muhammad, the founder of Islam. He has chapters on Shakespeare and Luther and so forth, but his main chapter is the prophet as hero, he says, or the hero as prophet. That, I think, is probably correct. He was a towering individual who, through force of personality in the book which he delivered, made history utterly unlike what would have been expected otherwise. Nowadays, of course, in the West, we have this new Eastern question. The principal preoccupation for our politicians in Europe seems to be immigration, and that usually is a kind of metaphor for the unwanted Muslim presence. And we see them leading the polls now in countries that were the bastion of sort of liberal politics, in Denmark now, in Norway, certainly in Holland, Geert Wilders, who has said that he wants a tax on hijab wearers and the banning of the Quran and so forth, as the most popular politician in Holland. So what we've been talking about is by no means just of interest to medievalists. It's part of our urgent reality in modern Europe. So a recovery of a sense, not of an idealizing of Muslim civilization, which has its dark side as well as its positives, but the recovery, hopefully by competent historians, of a vision of Islamic culture as something that's revolutionary in a positive way is, I think, something that will go a long way to assuage the anxieties of an increasing number of voters across the Western world. I'd like to see more historians and experts and theologians step up and write in the papers. Professors tend not to participate much in the public conversation. They leave it to Nigel Farage and his hangers-on. It's not a very developed conversation, I'm afraid. So the academics need to roll up their sleeves and set the record straight, not in some kind of pietistic or idealizing way, because nobody will buy that. The past was certainly never, ever perfect. But in order to reassure people that the arrival of significant numbers of people from the Islamic world, which has to continue, given that nobody's having babies any longer in Europe and immigration is the key to our survival. It's not really a choice. It's something that shouldn't be treated as a kind of importation of a mythical clash of civilizations, but as something that presents challenges, but also, I think, new possibilities for enrichment and conversations and maybe even solutions to some of the problems that are internal to Western culture at the moment.
We want to let you know about a live recording of Past, Present, Future that is going to be happening on Saturday the 29th of March as part of the Curious Minds Festival in Bath. It's 11 a.m. on that day, and it is a conversation between me and Robert Saunders, who was our guide to the history of British general elections, about Winston Churchill. This year is the 60th anniversary of Churchill's death, the 80th anniversary of his greatest triumph, VE Day, and the 110th anniversary of his greatest disaster, Gallipoli. And Robert Saunders and I are going to be exploring who Churchill really was, the man and the myth, and what he means for Britain today. If you would like to come and be part of the audience for that recording, priority booking opens for PPF listeners this Tuesday at 9 a.m. There is a link in our show description, or you can just go to the new events page on our website, ppfideas.com, and you will find out there how you can get tickets. The event is called Churchill, the Politician with 9 Lives, myself and Robert Saunders, and we would love to see you there in Bath on the 29th of March. Next time in our series on the history of revolutionary ideas, we are going to be back in England at the beginning of the 13th century. I'm going to be talking to the historian Nick Vincent about Magna Carta, which is often held up as the founding document of our liberties. Was it really? And if it wasn't, what was it? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.